Hello, guys. Welcome to the last of our live streams for 2018. I gotta say, it's pretty crazy that we've done this. Before I begin this one, I just want to go over the books that we've done so far for this year, just as a little throwback, so you guys can really realize exactly how much we covered, which is just quite a bit, to be quite honest. It is quite a bit. So we had our first book club, which was The Magic of Malini. That was in April. Then we did Tarbell. That was in May. We did Magic and Showmanship by Henning Nelms. We've done Sleight of Hand by Edwin Sachs. We've done The Card Magic of Lapal, which was a great one. We've done The Expert at the Card Table. We've done The Secret Life of Houdini. We've done Absolute Magic by Darren Brown. And we're on our last one of the year, The Last Greatest Magician. So it is quite a few books that we've been through. And before we start this last one, I just want to thank you guys for joining. This has sort of just been like the pilot of what I would love to turn into a bigger production, something that has higher production values. My goal in the future, when I can figure out the equipment, is to do the live streams with you guys in the moment and then provide you with really high res versions afterwards. And that would require me to have a camera set up without a recording limit with a external recorder, and I would give that to you and integrate all the comments into it that way, with and be able to edit the final product into showing different pages from the book and stuff like that. So that is what I'm going to be working on for the future of the book club. But that is a lot of work, obviously, as you all know. But I just want to thank you guys. And for those of you who have actually picked up some of these books and have gone through them, there's so many good stuff that we've gone through. So I really do hope that you've gotten something out of that. And without further ado, we will be discussing this month's book. This is The Last Greatest Magician in the World by Jim Steinmeyer. The Battles of the American Wizards. Howard Thurston versus Houdini. Sorry, I was reading that backwards on the screen. So before we get into this book, I do want to, first of all, it is a really beautiful book. This is the dust jacket, but I wanted to show you guys the book without the dust jacket because it really is special. First of all, this is the dust jacket, just so you guys can see it. There's the side. You got a little Thurston portrait right there. That's the back praise for Jim Steinmeyer. So you can hear quotes about Jim Steinmeyer from Neil Patrick Harris, Neil Gaiman, Teller, a bunch of really high-profile people. And I want to talk about Jim Steinmeyer in a moment. I just want to show you guys the actual book. I believe there's a few versions of this book. I think you can get an ebook version of this, but I got, when it was first released, the hardcover version, and this was available in just an ordinary bookstore. We have a big chain of bookstores, and because Jim Steinmeyer always works with big publishers, he doesn't write like traditional magic books that we would know of, where it's just like techniques and secrets and going trick after trick. Jim Steinmeyer writes really historical magic books, and he still goes into the techniques, but it's not his books aren't really written, at least his books for the public, which this is a book written for the public aren't written to describe techniques and to really teach them. But yeah, that's the front. You can see that beautiful shine off this, the JS for Jim Steinmeyer. We've got a little motifs from the show. The same thing with the side there. It just is a really beautiful book. You guys can see that shine. It really does look wonderful. And it is a fairly large book, coming in at around 350 pages, maybe a little more, 370, including all the credits. And this book is on Howard Thurston, so you guys know. Also, there's a section, and I love these sections in books. There's a couple, posters and stuff shown throughout the book, but they do have a section with like that laminated paper with photos, and so you can see Houdini hanging out with Howard Thurston. Thurston is a young guy. This is really cool. This is when Thurston, couldn't book a theater, they would have the Thurston tent. You guys can see that in the top corner. That's a Thurston tent, and that's an actual photograph of how they would set it up. They would set up the tent and run shows in there. A lot of great photos in this book. But before we really get into this book, and it really is a great book. This is a book published by Penguin, or a subdivision of Penguin. Penguin is a very big publisher in the U.S. I think it's a global publisher, really, but they do have smaller branches that publish books on different things, and they have worked with Jim Steinmeyer on his books before. For those of you who don't know Jim Steinmeyer, I feel like I need to give him a little bit of an introduction. I was introduced to Jim Steinmeyer by one of my friends, Shane Cobalt, who is a magician from Toronto, and he would always talk about Steinmeyer. He'd always he'd always be talking about Steinmeyer. Steinmeyer is a magician, and he's a illusion builder. He's an illusion designer, and he's had a very long career. He's worked with, I believe, pretty much every great magician who's been active while he's been alive. His first big gig working as an illusion designer was working with Doug Henning, I believe back in the 70s. I can't tell you exactly what year, but if you read the book on Doug Henning, this book right here, Spellbound, this is a biography on Doug Henning, and they talk about Jim Steinmeyer in that book. He came to work for Doug Henning as an illusion designer. Later, he would work for David Copperfield, creating designing many illusions for David Copperfield. If you've ever seen the illusion of so many illusions, have you ever seen the illusion of David Copperfield making the Statue of Vanity, Statue of Liberty disappear? That's Jim Steinmeyer. He designed that, and he's worked with everyone in the business. Ricky Jay, you name it. I mean, he's worked with everyone, and he really is. I'm not too much in the illusion world, but from what I've heard, he is either the best or one of the best in the field of designing and building illusions. He really is fantastic. And Jim Steinmeyer, I've seen him lecture. He's written many, many books just for magicians as well. And they're wonderful. They're wonderful. And he's also written books for the public. He's also written non-magic books. One of his latest books, which I read because I'm a fan of Jim Steinmeyer, he wrote a book on Dracula, and it was, how this character of Dracula was created by Bram Stoker and the history of that. That was a very fascinating read, and also very fascinating because Bram Stoker worked for the top, uh, uh, what do you call it? The top director in theater in London in those days, and Bram Stoker was able to see behind the scenes and working behind the scenes on some of the most uh, sophisticated stage effects, stage technique, what they call stagecraft in the UK and probably the world. If you hear Bram Stoker and other people write about the plays that he was involved in at that time, which Jim Steinmeyer talks about in the book, the special effects were ridiculous. They would have, uh, and this is in like the late 1800s. They would have scenes where people were having a fight on stage, like a sword fight, and they had special contraptions where the swords could be electrically charged, and the actors had wire all throughout their clothing that connected to the sword, and then it would connect to copper plates on the floor that they could, transmit that electrical charge through their boots. So these guys would be doing their sword fighting, moving on different parts of the stage, and it would be set up so that when they're standing on different parts of the stage and bringing their swords together, you would see like boom, a flash of electricity, like a flare. It was incredible for the time, and and that's only one example. There's a ton of examples of just brilliant stuff that they were doing on the stage, making it seem like there was thunder, different sound effects, different ways to achieve those illusions, which aren't the illusions that we're used to in magic, but are used in theater. And now, pretty much everything, pretty much everything can be done digitally, but back then it could not. So they had to really be clever on how they designed stuff, and it seems to be pretty incredible what they were achieving. But you got to read this book, and we're going to talk about this book, but read the book on Bram Stoker. It's not a magic book, but it really is interesting. So definitely, I would also recommend that. I'm just a huge fan of Jim Steinmeyer. He is a great magician, and he's a great historian of magic. So he's written this book on Howard Thurston, who was active. We have to sort of look at the time that Howard Thurston was active. Howard Thurston was active during the time of Chung Ling Soo, during the time of Houdini. He was very, very active at the turn of the 20th century and continued. He was really the last, the title, the last greatest magician in the world, means he was he was really the last guy that toured, billing himself as the greatest magician in the world. There used to be a habit, a tradition in magic for magicians to advertise themselves as the greatest magician in the world and tour, and boast about how big their show was. Like, my show was 20 tons, and it takes 3 railroad carriages to bring the show from this town to this town. They would brag about how physically big their show was, and all the places that they had been. And you have to consider the years that Howard Thurston was active, leading up to the Depression in the U.S., to understand why he was such a big deal, and also why the tradition of touring never really resumed after Howard Thurston. Howard Thurston was really the last big touring magicians. Now, that's not to say there weren't ever any magicians touring after him, but he was really the last guy touring with a big show. Since then, you've had Doug Henning do it sort of, and you've had David Copperfield who has obviously done that in his life. Mm, but in terms of big show, I mean, you're talking about a gap of, I don't know how many years that is, 40 years or so, where there weren't, big tours. But we'll get into that. Um, so Howard Thurston, what a guy. To understand sort of how big his name was, you'd have to sort of compare him to the guys that were around back then. And not only in magic, in the field of entertainment, you have to consider that, there wasn't really a Hollywood at this time. There weren't, stardom was very different. So some of the biggest guys in their names was Barnum. So if anybody has seen The Greatest Showman, the movie with Hugh Jackman that came out last year or a few months ago, I think it was last year, about Barnum, who ran sort of an exhibit or a show, and it was just like a really big show of oddities. Barnum was a very big name at that time. Ziegfeld, the Ringling Brothers, who some of you might know, the Ringling Brothers was a very big circus at the time, and it even continued to be a very big circus uh, until a few decades ago. It slowly dropped off, and I think last year it was completely shut down, unfortunately. But the circus used to be amazing. They have a movie called The Greatest Show on Earth, which is about the Ringling Brothers Circus. And it is a phenomenal movie. And you actually see the real circus acts in that movie. I think the movie's from the 70s. You guys should check it out. So Thurston was Thurston was a very interesting guy, to say the least. I'm going to put the book down for a bit because I'm being sort of distracted by everything that's in the book. And I could talk about everything that's in the book, but it's too big. So I sort of want to put the book down and talk about Howard Thurston. I just want to make sure I get some dates right. So I'm going to actually pull up his biography just so that I can hit some dates and not, have to relook through the book. So Howard Thurston. Howard Thurston was born July 20th in 1869, and he was from Columbus, Ohio. And he was actually buried, I believe, in Columbus, Ohio as well. If he's not, I think technically he's buried in Forest Lawn in Ohio, but I'll have to check. I'm going there in a few weeks, and I'm going to try to visit his grave because he does have a grave that you can visit in the public, and I've never visited his grave. And Howard Thurston influenced me in a lot of ways. He was really a character. He was a and the real story is in this book. Howard Thurston was very unhappy as a child, extremely unhappy as a child, and he actually ran away from home. I want to make sure that I get the story right. I want to make sure I get the story right. So Howard Thurston was either 12 or 13 years old, and he saw a performance by Herman the Great, who I think we've talked about Herman a little bit briefly, but we haven't really gone in depth about Herman. Herman came from a magical family. There used to be these great families of magic where it was passed down from generation to generation. And the Herman family was one of these families. So he went to go see Herman, who I believe it was Alexander Herman. I could be wrong, but he saw the matinee, and he in the matinee show they gave every single child in the audience a gift, and he waited in line to get his little gift, which contained a brass collar button, and he kept it with him for the rest of his life. Um, he ran away from home very young, and he he really moved around a lot, and he ran around selling newspapers and doing whatever job that he could, and part of it was a salesman, like little sales jobs that he was doing. Some of it was as a newspaper boy, and but he was really like just totally he was just totally out. He had severe problems with his family, and he was just out and about. uh, and one day he uh, he went back home. He was 15 years old, and he went home with all the money in his pocket, and he was very afraid of his father. And but he was getting into magic at that time, and his mother had a dream that he would be the world's greatest magician, and he remembers that with pride, because he realized that he had no commitment to an honest life of work. um, Once he left Ohio at that young age, he he got into crime. Howard Thurston got into crime. He joined a gang at that time of thieves, and he was taught to pickpockets. And this was not, by the way, I'm telling you guys this. This was not something that is really known in magic history. Howard Thurston never talked about it in his life. It's not like he bragged about it, like, oh, yeah, I used to be an expert pickpocket, now I'm a magician. This is something that he never talked about. This is something that, they had to really do research on. And so, very early on in his life, he was into crime. Howard Thurston's brother was also a notorious criminal at that time, just notorious, and they were both into crime. Uh, he ended up, I believe, being arrested. I want to make sure I get this right. So he was arrested in New York, and he was, I think, too young to go to prison. So he was turned over to a gentleman called William Round, who I don't know, I don't remember exactly what William Round's role was, but his he was trying to get Howard Thurston to turn his life around. When you're that young, you don't go to prison. Um, so they were trying to find him jobs, and they actually would send him to church. And he joined a community which was sort of like a religious community. I don't know if it's a religious order, but it was called the Moody's Christian School. It was called Mount Hermon Academy. Dwight Moody's Christian School. And I don't know too much about Moody, but he seemed to have had like a popular influence on a specific branch of Christianity in that time in the US. And many people in that time knew about Moody and the work that he was doing. So it is pretty interesting that he ended up at this school for this, this really religious school, and they were, trying to reform him to get him back into life. And yeah, it says right here, Reverend Dwight Moody was a 19th century celebrity in the world of evangelism. So he was very famous in the Christian community at that time in the U.S., which is pretty interesting to note, because Howard Thurston always, as he became older, he was always grateful of the time and the people that he met at Moody, and he would always talk about this Moody school and how it really transformed his life. And as Howard Thurston was older, he would always go to both the different Moody schools, and he would go to orphanages and hospitals and perform for free. And he would always bring gifts for the kids and give talks to the kids as well, and talk about his life and how he was also living on the streets and into crime, and that this school turned him around. So it's pretty interesting. And it the interesting part about it is Thurston had such a clean public image that you would never really expect this about him, like this criminal side of him. But he did have it, but he kept it a secret. And one of his first shows, I think his first public magic show, was for the Moody Christmas dinner in 1890. So that is pretty interesting. All right, now we're getting on to more of the magic stuff, which I am more comfortable talking about. Howard Thurston, once he was of age and he sort of left that community, I believe he still did small jobs here and there, and he started to make connections. He made connections, and I believe the connections were family connections to the theater business, and so he would perform and just build up his name, and he was actually really good, and he was very clever, and he performed stuff in his own style. He was a very interesting guy, and when you read about his show, I mean, the development of his show is quite fascinating because, like everybody, he started off as like a nobody. Nobody knew who he was. So he sort of needed to build his reputation, and he thought he could build his reputation by fooling a great magician. So how like today we have, Penn and Teller's Fool Us. They didn't have that back then. They had, magicians who were working. They had TV shows. So what he did is he found Leon Herman, which was not Herman the Great that he saw earlier. Leon was, I think, the nephew of Alexander Herman, and he went to do an impromptu performance to him one day. Just behind the scenes. Oh, hey, yeah, I'm a magician too. Can I show you something? And he fooled Leon Herman. He fooled him with the rising cards, with his version of the rising cards. And it's quite interesting because as you read the story, this was a totally rigged event. He rigged it so there was a guy from the newspaper there who could write about it, and so that he got publicity from it. And Leon Herman was totally unprepared. Also, working for Leon Herman behind the scenes, I believe at that time was William Robinson. For those of you who know William Robinson, who would later become famous on stage as Chung Ling Soo, he worked as a magic assistant for many magicians for many years behind the scenes. And at that time, he was working for Leon Herman, and he helped Howard Thurston because he respected him. Howard Thurston was actually very good at magic, but he helped him set up his rig for the invisible thread. As the story goes, he helped make it more deceiving, a more convincing illusion in that moment, so that Leon Herman, couldn't figure out there were little invisible threads floating around. So that it's a very interesting story, and he started to get popular with that, and he billed it as he fooled Herman. Now, as I said, there were these great magic families, these famous magic families. The Hermans were one of these families, and I don't think they took too kindly to that because he didn't fool really everybody who he didn't fool the Herman that everybody was familiar with. He fooled like a lesser Herman. Like he didn't fool Herman the Great. He fooled like Herman the Great's nephew, who was like, not as good as a magician. So there was that, but he just, he fooled Herman, and he used it to, promote himself, to bill himself. And it's quite interesting. It's like if somebody were to put on their resume that they fooled Copperfield. It's like, you fooled David Copperfield? No, it wasn't David Copperfield. It was his nephew, Robert Copperfield. But he's David Copperfield's nephew, and he also does magic. So I fooled Copperfield on the on the billing. It's that sort of situation that's happening. So it's pretty funny when you do read it, and you do find out the story behind it. But he was an excellent magician. He would perform stuff in his own style. He performed a lot of card manipulation. I believe that's how he started his act. I believe most of his act was card manipulation, which he was said to be very good at card manipulation. And uh, if you read sort of the back, channels, the letters that people were writing to each other at that time, the private letters, which some of them have become public, you can see that people were talking and really impressed by Howard Thurston and his technique. Um, so he had a rising stature, and he didn't have money always, so he'd have to make some, shady deals with his brother and other people to try to raise money to go on tours. For those of you who don't realize, being a magician back then was not like being a magician now. When you're running a big show, you have to have a lot of employees. So Howard Thurston, when he was running his show, he literally had dozens of employees, and they cost a lot of money, and you need to have a way to you need to build the props. You need to have the props designed. You need to transport the props. You need a lot of work goes into a big illusion show, especially the type that he was doing. So it was not easy for Howard Thurston to, you know, to pay all of this, uh, you know, all this magic. Uh, it was very, it was very expensive. I want to see if Howard Thurston. I want to see if Jim Steinmeyer wrote anything online about, because I know he's given many interviews, but I want to see what's not in the book. And by the way, at that time, there was there were Magic. I think Magic was always competitive, but at that time, it was really hyper competitive. And so, as Thurston progressed in his career, uh, the, there was there was there was a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes. Um, Lies told. There were real rivalries, and some of it had to do. Some of it was financially related. Some of it was not. As I said, Howard Thurston did not have a lot of money at that time when he was starting out and at different points of his career. So early on, when he was doing his show, he's literally traveling from town to town and skipping out on bills. So he'd be running up hotel bills, theater bills, everything, running up the tab. And then before paying them, he would skip town and go to the next town. And so he sort of had like this con man spirit to him where he was running a legitimate business, but he was running a legitimate business illegally, like illegitimately. Sorry, I can't speak. It's too complicated, those two words. Um, and so, for example, like he'd get arrested in a town for not paying the bills, and then he'd like fool the police officers by being like, "Oh, look, I have this gold watch and this and this. Hold it. I need to call this. I need to get in touch with this person. We're gonna get the money to you right away." Blah blah blah, and they'd totally buy it, and then they'd be left with like a useless trinket. And so he had all these like con artist schemes that he would pull on the police officers and different people everywhere that he would go. And he'd really screw people over financially, Howard Thurston. So it is pretty funny to read about in the book because you would never get a sense of it when you're reading about Howard Thurston from his own books or from, the different magic magazines at the time because people don't know about it. People don't know what he was doing behind the scenes. Um, let's see, Jim Steinmeyer. One of the big things in the book is they try to show a rivalry in between Howard Thurston and Houdini. Um, and they go into the rivalry in the book. They were both really big magicians at the same time. They sort of were competing. I mean, I think it's said best in the classic phrase that America only has room in its heart for one magician at a time. So it seems like the trend in America for a very long time, more than 100 years, has been for the public to only fall in love with one magician at a time and to really, be in love with that one magician and then, eventually move on to another magician. And because they were performing at the same time, Houdini and Thurston, that same competition was active. And a lot of it ties into Keller. For those of you who know Harry Keller, I think we talked a little bit about Harry Keller. Harry Keller was just a grand magician. He was literally the biggest magician in the US for many years before Houdini exploded. He was like the one big magician, Harry Keller. He was magic. When he died, they put in the newspapers, "Magic is dead." I believe that was Keller when Keller died. I mean, he was maybe it was Keller, maybe it was Heller. Maybe I'm getting confused. Heller or Keller. Either way, Keller was a big deal. And if we're talking about Heller, Heller was literally right before Keller. So I could be confused in between those two names. But Keller was a very big magician. If you want to read more about Keller, there's a great book written by Mike Caveney on Keller and his career. It's very fascinating. Keller was a great magician himself, but how Keller ties into Houdini and Thurston is when Keller was retiring, he wanted to sell his show. And he wanted not only to sell his show, but sort of sell his career, sell his relationships with the theaters, sell his name. And the way it ended up working was it went to Howard Thurston. So if you look at a lot of Howard Thurston's posters, let me just pull one up right now. Howard Thurston poster. You will see an image. You'll see an image of Keller uh, in the corner, like a little drawing of Keller, and it will say Keller's successor. And it says, Mr. Keller says, Thurston will be the greatest magician the world has ever known. So to have like a quote of it would have a quote of Keller in the poster. And one of the famous magic posters is Keller actually putting on like this cape on Howard Thurston. Uh, Trying to find it. There's so many Thurston posters. You do a search for Keller. See if that comes up. Oh, here it is. Yeah, so one of the posters is great. It says Thurston, Keller's successor, and you actually have Keller in the poster, and they're both dressed up. And so Thurston is in the middle, and Keller is on one side putting a cape on Thurston, and on the other side is like this like a human-sized devil sort of character putting the cape also on Thurston. And it says Thurston, big letters on top, Keller's successor. And with a quote, Thurston will be the greatest magician the world has ever known. Invested with the mantle of magic. So they were really selling it when you study the old magic posters, and how they were selling it was that Keller was the greatest magician in the world at the time, and he was passing off. He was handing off the torch to this younger magician who would carry on the flame of magic. I'm the greatest magician in the world, and I'm passing that responsibility to you. You will be the greatest magician the world has ever known. And so he did that for Thurston instead of Houdini. Now it's quite fascinating when you read about the history in between Houdini and Keller and Thurston Keller. You can really see that Keller actually has a better relationship with Houdini. Keller really sees Harry Houdini as a son, and I personally believe he wanted to give that honor to Houdini. The thing is, Howard Thurston was not given that offer, it was not given to him. He paid for it, and he paid a ridiculous amount of money. And I guess it was so much money that, Keller accepted giving that honor to Howard Thurston, even though he didn't like Howard Thurston as much. Howard Thurston, by the way, was a very good magician. This is not to knock Howard Thurston. But my feeling reading the book and reading things I've read is that Keller really preferred Houdini, but he had to give it to Thurston because Thurston was paying him so much money for it. I don't think Houdini. I think he gave the offer to a few magicians, like I'm going to sell my show, and there were a few magicians who really. There were only a few magicians who could really, pay that what it was, and Houdini was one of them, and Thurston was the other. But I think Thurston gave, just offered more money, so that's how he got it. That's how he got the role of successor, Keller's successor, and he used it for a very long time in all his posters and advertisings. Um, so it is quite fascinating, but much of the book revolves, not the whole book, but part of the book. I guess this is just how they advertise the book, really, to make it seem like a battle between Houdini and Howard Thurston. In reality, it seems like they were friends. They were both very successful magicians. They were both very good. They respected each other's work. I don't, every magician has slight problems with other magicians throughout their career. That's just the nature of the business. But you don't really see a huge amount of animosity as you would expect. Like there were some real problems between, you know, magicians, but you don't really see that in the book between Thurston and Houdini. Uh, this is a great book. So when you read this book, it's pretty interesting because there were some, believe it or not, there were some magic magazines around at that time, such as the Sphinx, the Conjurer's Monthly. There were a few magazines, and they all focused on magic, and these were magic magazines for magicians like we have today. And there were so these guys were written about, their shows were written about. So when they would add something new to their show, they were doing a new tour. Oh, this magician has a new tour and he's traveling through this country. They'd, add stuff to the show, take stuff out. You can follow the history of their career also through newspapers, and that's how a lot of this book is compiled. When these guys are writing history books, they're taking the public record, like what's in newspapers, reviews of shows, dates that shows went to different places, how big the theater was, what was going on. Then they're taking, the record that, people reviewed the shows, people wrote about the shows in the magazines. And then also you have private letters that people would write to each other. And that's sort of how we compile history and tell these stories. And there's also stories, transmitted through word of mouth and sort of passed on through magician to magician. There were magic books written at that time, and Jim Steinmeyer is just so great because he really, just goes everywhere and just puts everything together. And so you really do follow Howard Thurston throughout his career. But this is like, even though this is Howard Thurston's story, this is not just about Howard Thurston. This is about um, many magicians of that time. You have them talking about T. Nelson Downs, who was the king of coins. You have them talking about the Bambergs. You have uh, Paul Valadon, Dr. Wilson, obviously Houdini, Chung Ling Soo, Billy Robinson, David Devant, Maskelyne. You have many stories intersecting. So when you do read books like this, it's sort of it's sort of hard at first because all these names might be new to you. You might be like, who the heck is George White? Oh, George White. He was, Howard Thurston's assistant who worked with him for decades. Howard Thurston, I forget the whole story, but he got George White as a child. I mean, he was a child, a little African American child that I don't know if Thurston bought him. I don't know how the heck that worked, but he didn't have parents or family. And Howard Thurston basically raised this kid, and the kid worked in the show as an assistant, and he worked with him for decades of his life. And then after Howard Thurston retired and died, all that stuff happened. George White was a very respected member of the magic community. He wasn't a magician, but he was well known as being this magic assistant who had literally grown up with the Howard Thurston show. And after Howard Thurston died, he went on to work for, I believe, Dante. So there's all these guys' stories throughout this book. And as you're reading this book, they have Carter, um, as you're reading this book, there's so many magicians mentioned, and it can sort of seem overwhelming because there is a lot in this book. But you have to, when you read it, especially if you read Jim Steinmeyer's other books, he's written books on Houdini, he's written books on many magicians, Shang Tzu. When you read these books, you really get an inside look of how these guys were living, what was going on behind the scenes, who was good, why they were good, what they were performing. And you do get the detailed versions of the tricks that they had in the shows. For example, this book has what I believe to be Howard Thurston's Rising Cards, which Rising Cards is sort of a controversial subject, but I honestly believe that this might be the best Rising Cards that I've ever heard about. And Jim Steinmeyer walks you through the whole routine. Even though this is a book for the public, it's written in a way that you really do have to work to get the information. And it's a very hard routine. If you want to actually do it, it's not easy. It requires you to, have a show with an assistant and really have everything timed out. But it is in here, and it is a great, great method for the Rising Cards. It's probably the best method. With the best setup, everything in this book. He also talks about not only the small close-up stuff. Oh, speaking of, the manipulation stuff, Howard Thurston was very. I don't know if he's credited in the end with creating the back palm, but they do talk about him inventing the back palm. Now, there's some controversy whether he actually invented the back palm or not. But they do talk about it in the book, I believe. They also talk about his ability to scale. Howard Thurston was an expert at scaling cards, and he'd throw cards out into the audience. He had these like souvenir cards that he would give out, and he would give them out in the show by throwing them out to audience members, scaling them to the balcony, just like whipping them. So, just imagine, what Ricky Jay does with cards, just throwing them. He was like that. But I think he was the first guy on stage who could really do it well. And he made it like a feature of his show. It was like he was known for being able to throw cards really well. And it was a part of his show. They talk about the illusions in the show. A lot of illusions in the show I won't even talk about. I can't even talk about most of them just because I'm not an illusion person. But it is really fun to hear them being described. My favorite one being the levitation of the Princess Karnak, which is, I think it's widely acknowledged to be Howard Thurston's greatest masterpiece. It's a levitation effect, but just the way that he performed it was extremely magical. Just the atmosphere, just everything. The girl who played the role was incredible. I mean, it was something else. It was really special. And they do talk exactly about how that is done and funny stories as well. Without going into too many of the technical details, because it is quite difficult to describe, for that illusion, it required this setup with these wires, and these were wires that you could not see from the audience. But if you were on stage at certain angles and close, you could see the wires hanging down. And Howard Thurston would bring a committee of people, or he'd bring, he'd bring people up, different number of people, I believe, at different times in his career, up on stage to sort of see her float up close. And the illusion was totally visible for them, but he didn't care because they didn't know what they were seeing. So they were looking at it, and their eyes were like, what the heck am I seeing? But he was smart enough to realize that it was worth ruining the magic for a few people because it would make the magic stronger. Everyone in the audience would see these people up on stage up close and they'd be shocked, especially because the people weren't like, what the heck? What is that, a wire? The people would just be standing there. He really had it blocked out well, so they'd be standing at specific parts of the stage and look shocked, like, oh wow, you know Howard Thurston was really smart. He was a great magician. He really understood how to stage things and how to present them. He was a phenomenal magician. Um, so that is the levitation of the princess. And there's a funny story in the book. It is so funny of Howard Thurston telling a kid. There's a small kid that comes up on stage, and I think the story, I don't remember the exact story, but I think the kid is about to say something about the wires, and Howard Thurston goes to him and he whispers in his ear. I think they interviewed the guy many years later. He whispers in his ear, don't if he whispers something like, if you say an effing word about this, I will effing kill you, to this kid. And so the kid, when he hears these words, by the way, this is like early, I don't know, this is probably the 1920s. I forget exactly what year, but this was not a time when people used this language. The language existed, but a child would not hear that on stage whispered in their ear. So the kid was horrified, and his eyes just like went wide, and he was like, and everybody in the audience looks at this poor kid and thinks that he's seeing the most amazing thing in his life, when really his life has just been threatened by Howard Thurston. Howard Thurston just threatened to kill him. So you do have very funny moments like that in the book, and as far as I know, it's a real story. And Howard Thurston actually used to do that to children. So it is pretty funny. It's actually really funny, and the psychology behind it is especially interesting because Howard Thurston knew that those kids also wouldn't say anything to anybody because they were so like rattled, and they would never repeat a word like that. It's not like today in America where the kids are saying the F word here and just swearing all over the place. They would never use that word. And so, yeah, it is extremely fascinating to see that dynamic. And then going on later in the book, I mean, Howard Thurston, he had a great career. He traveled throughout the U.S. He was building himself up, and he was just totally successful, unfortunately. And the reason why the book focuses on, I believe, his rivalry with Houdini, what they call the rivalry with Houdini, is because we still know Houdini today. The public still knows Houdini, and they know that he was an escape artist. They may not know specific details, but the name Houdini is so famous that it's sort of like lasted. Whereas Howard Thurston, the name doesn't mean anything to most people in the U.S. and I think anywhere. Like, I think if you just walk on the street in the U.S. and you ask, 100 people, do you know who Howard Thurston is? people would be like, Howard Thurston? Who? I don't think 1 in 100 would know Howard Thurston. I don't think really anybody would know Howard Thurston. Whereas if you ask them, hey, have you ever heard of Houdini? Yeah, Harry Houdini. Have you ever heard of Harry Houdini? They'd say, most people would say, yeah, I heard that name. I don't really know what it is, but yeah, I heard about Houdini. They would know the name. So I think that's what the book sort of builds itself on, being like, this investigation to see uh, why Thurston was forgotten after such a successful career, why Houdini was remembered. I don't think it's so sad that Thurston was forgotten by the public. I mean, I think most magicians who have ever performed have been totally forgotten by the public. Um, if you ask, people might have an idea of the magicians that were around, but they don't know the names. They don't know who any of these. Like if T. Nelson Downs, Cardini, who was a big name. You ask people, hey, have you ever heard of Cardini? Be like, Cardini? I don't know. Who's Cardini? Like most people would not know. If you ask people, have you ever heard of T. Nelson Downs? Have you ever heard of Harry Keller? Have you heard of, and you just go through these names. Most people will not know, but they'll know Houdini. They'll know Houdini. So this book is a look at that, especially because Houdini died while Thurston was still performing. Houdini died in 1926. So Howard Thurston was still active at that time. And but you read the book. You really must read the book. This is a great book. Um, I think that's all I'm going to say about it because I really don't want to spoil the book. It's just there really is nothing to spoil. It's just the fascinating life story of Howard Thurston, who really was a phenomenal magician. Don't let anybody tell you differently. Howard Thurston was a great magician. I don't care if nobody knows who he is today. He was amazing. Look at the posters, look at his artwork, look at his actual show, which his show, by the way, is very well documented and recorded. I believe that we even have the script to most of his show. Don't quote me on that. But very, very interesting show, very good show. And he made a very successful career. Read the book. It's a fantastic book. If you do want to find out more about Howard Thurston after you've read the book, there's a few other books that you should read. There's Fooling Millions by Howard Thurston. Howard Thurston wrote a few magic books. Like you guys see that old brown book right there? That is 400 Tricks You Can Do by Howard Thurston. That was like a book that he sold after the shows. Originally, it was like 200 tricks that you could do, and then those were like two different books, and they combined them into one book. So that's what I have right there. It's a really bad beginner's book in magic, but it actually does have some pretty cool ideas in it. And I found it in an old magic auction, so I just bought it. I'm a fan of Howard Thurston. It's like $15 or whatever. I just bought it. um, but Howard Thurston did write a few books. Let me just make sure I give you guys the right information. So there's Fooling Millions. There's Howard Thurston's Tricks with Cards, 50 New Card Tricks, Howard Thurston's Easy Pocket Tricks, The Mishaps of Magicians, Fooling Millions, Tales of Magic and Mystery, My Life of Magic, the 400 Tricks You Can Do. Now, there's also a book written by Howard Thurston's wife, I want to say. My Magic Life. The book is called My Magic Life. And so there's a book written by Howard Thurston's wife, Grace Thurston, which is actually pretty interesting. Um, it's called My Magic Life, My Magic Husband, and it is a very good book, and it does talk about behind the scenes. Now, I'm not too sure what the relationship was when Grace Thurston wrote this. I believe she was separated uh, from Thurston, but I'm not too sure. Let me just see Grace Thurston. I forget exactly what happened with Grace Thurston. Okay, so that's exactly what happened. So they did get a divorce. Howard Thurston had four wives in his lives. Four wives in his life. Um, but she was married to him when she was 15 years old. So and she does talk about their early life living together in poverty. Howard Thurston's problems with the law, going to jail. The you get a lot of um, stories from her, as well as stories about his apparent abuse of her. Apparently, Howard Thurston was an abusive husband. That's just the way it was. I don't know. The book goes into that. How his wife talks about it. It's kind of hard to imagine when you're seeing only the public persona of a character, like somebody on stage, and they're abusive to their wife and and family. But she does talk about it, and her book is a wonderful read. I read it a long time ago, so you probably do want to check that out. Um, but yeah, do read about Howard Thurston and check out Jim Steinmeyer's other books because that guy is a fantastic author, really smart guy. He is probably, and I don't say this lightly, Jim Steinmeyer is probably the smartest guy in magic. There's only a few guys who are like really, really smart in magic. Jim Steinmeyer is one of them. Like I'll tell you, there's only like I don't know, maybe four or five people who are really smart in magic. And I'm not just talking about like one area. I'm talking about like just smart. And Jim Steinmeyer is one of them. So you must, it's an absolute must that you familiarize yourself with Jim Steinmeyer's work because he is just a genius of magic and he works very hard, is very approachable. He's a very friendly guy, surprisingly. That's how it works. Usually the guys who are really good at stuff and really smart are usually a lot friendlier than the guys who might have a big reputation but may not be so good. Maybe that comes from insecurity. I don't know. But Jim Steinmeier is definitely not insecure. He's a smart guy, very smart guy. So do check that out, guys. This is the end. This is the end. Um, Let me put this book back in the dust jacket. This is the end of our book club for this year. Uh, I honestly can't believe it. I mean, I honestly cannot believe it. How far we've gone in 1 year. I look at the books and just how, like, as I was reading at the beginning of this live stream, just the titles of the books to you guys, it kind of just dawns on me how much we actually read. It is not an insignificant amount. We've covered more books in this year than most magicians read in 10 years. And I believe that the books that we've covered were very good books. And, some of them, I want to talk about the future of what I'm doing with the book club as well, because this has been a new experience for me, as you guys know. And I mean, right now, and since the beginning, it's just been purely, uh, purely experimental. Literally, the first time I've ever done anything like this, and I've enjoyed it. I think you guys have enjoyed it. This was sort of like a test run for me. We're continuing next month, which is 2019. Uh, but now that we've had a successful, we've proved the concept. I want to take stuff to the next level. As I told you, I want the production value to go up on these, and you guys will see what I mean in the future. After these streams, I want to give you guys really good videos. So as we are going through the books, we'll do it live like this. But then when you do get a copy of the video later, it's not just a replay of the live stream. My goal is to have a replay of the like just have a secondary camera recording it in HD. So you do have an HD copy, but not so there's only on me talking the whole time. I'm going to cut that and put images of the book over that. So when I'm talking about this part of the book, you'll see an image here or a selection from the book. I just need to do some research on the legality of stuff, because I don't want to do anything illegal. I don't want to put like chunks of the book up in videos that I'm creating for you guys. If that's not legal, I have to really do research and make sure that's legal, because I don't want to violate copyright law. That would not be cool, and I don't want to do that at all. So I have to see what I can do. But I do want to give you guys an experience that you guys can follow along and really get as much as you can from the books. And as a personal note from me, it was very hard for me scheduling the books in advance. I thought it would be a good idea at first, just because I would know what I was doing for the year, and it was a very bad idea, because some of these books I did not feel like I was in the mood to read them. Like I was working on other magic books, I was working on other things, and there were some books that I really struggled to get through. It's like, oh, book club is coming up. I got to read this book. I got a few weeks to read this whole book. I got this and this and this to do, but I have to read this whole, this book and then talk about it. It was a lot of stress, and it's not how I want to do it in the future. As we move on in the future, I do not want to announce the books too far in advance. I don't want to announce them a year in advance. I think I'll announce the books maybe at the end of the last live stream, because how I want to do it moving forward is I want you guys to really follow me as I buy new magic books, as I reread old magic books. I want it to be fresh, and I want it to be at a point where I'm actually inspired to read the books, rather than like having to grind through the book to talk to you about it. So um, I will tell you right now that actually I won't announce the first book, but I do have in mind the first book, and it's a book that I've been meaning to read for a while, really go through and study. So I probably will do the book that I have in mind. I'll make up my mind and announce it to you probably in a week or two. But I do not want moving forward to announce too far in advance which book that we'll be covering, just because to I want it to be fresh. I want to feel motivated to read the book. And I want to give you guys stuff that I'm reading about and thinking about in the moment, because when I'm really focusing on a subject and thinking about it, that's when I can present my ideas in the best way, not when I'm like having to reread something and then present it. It's very difficult. and not the best way because I don't have that internal motivation to give you guys my best that way. I can't give you guys my best that way, and I want to give you my best. So moving forward, that's the way we're going to do it. You'll hear about it a few weeks in advance. Book I'm reading, and we'll go. So yeah, that's it for the book club. What else do I want to say before we end this? We have the studies in magic. We have 8 studies in magic. The last one of the year coming up as well. Not too sure what the subject is going to be on that one yet. If you have watched the forcing one, let me know what you think. And I will let you know what I'm doing for the last studies in magic group. And after we do the last studies in magic group, I want to do a separate Google Meet with you guys where I don't know what day yet, but it will be one of the days where it's like a holiday and everybody's off. And what I want to do with the members of Patreon is to have like just a Google Meet, like a Google Hangout where we just hang out and it's the holidays and we just chat about magic. We just sit down, have a drink, have a coffee, have a hot chocolate, whatever it is you drink, water maybe. You can have also an alcoholic beverage if you're inclined. But just have a meet where we just sit down and talk about magic and hang out and do that. No, not where it's like a Q&A, where it'll be something where everybody has their webcam and mic and we actually just talk and hang out and talk about magic and talk about whatever comes up. Totally unstructured. So that'll be later this month as well. So as usual, I want to thank you guys. Really, it's been, and for those of you who are only in the book club, I want to thank you for joining. It really means a lot to me. I got to tell you, it's been a hard year. I'm seeing more and more bad magic on the internet, and just people not interested and really and not passionate about really understanding about magic and understanding the history of what magic is about and where we really came from. And it's what motivated me to create this in the first place, to have a place where I could talk to people who actually care about magic, a place where we can talk and I can, share what I know and we can have discussion about it. So I do thank you for joining me. This is, year one. And technically we haven't even gone through the whole year yet because we started a little later in the year, in I think April, but we will move forward and the quality of these will get better and we'll figure out what we're doing, I think. So thanks again for watching, really. And a lot of cool stuff that I have planned in the future, going around technology. I told you guys about the Reddit. I made a post about that I've created a subreddit. Right now, the subreddit is totally bare bones. It's empty. I'm aware of that. It's just I need time to create what I have in mind. And the last few weeks have been pretty busy. Really, every single time in my life is pretty busy, but I'm doing my best to stay on schedule and really create some great stuff for you guys. So anyways, hope you guys enjoy it. Thanks again for watching. And book club, I will see you next year. And happy holidays. Enjoy your holidays. Happy Hanukkah. Merry Christmas. Whatever else holiday is coming up. Enjoy it. And I will see you soon. Peace.